Mayoral candidates in the River City in full view in the final weeks before election. We're looking at the campaigns and what's left to prove for both Donna Deegan and Daniel Davis. Lawmakers and the state's leader in Tallahassee pushing through a dizzying number of bills. We'll give a review of the most recent legislation and what's yet to come before the end of session. Plus, courts in crisis. There's a judicial emergency in the view of our guest. Chris Hand joins us on This Week in Jacksonville. And good morning to you. Yeah, Chris Hand joining us once a month for a show that we call Hand on Government. Leans into your expertise, a career in government and a government law attorney. So we're going to start with a halftime report, if you will, on the mayoral campaign between Donna Deegan and Daniel Davis. Here we go. I mean, we're just a few weeks away from Election Day, really, which is May 16th, and early voting starts and mail-in voting. All of that is underway soon.
Well, Kent, that's a very apt analogy you use because that's exactly where we are at this point. We're halfway through the second election. As you remember, the first election was on March 21st. The second election is on May 16th, so we're about halfway into that. And the score is tied. There have been two polls in the last 10 days or so, one of which showed Donna Deegan's campaign at a poll which showed her slightly ahead, a UNF poll which essentially showed the race tied, her up by 1 point. So it's obviously a very close contest at this point. And the campaigns will spend the next month doing a couple of things, trying to persuade those remaining undecided voters, particularly no party affiliation or NPA voters, which are often key and decisive in these contests, and also trying to turn out their voters. In Donna Deegan's case, trying to make sure Democrats get to the polls. In Daniel Davis's case, trying to make sure Republicans get to the polls. And of course, there's an even bigger reason for that. As we recall, in the May 21st election, one of the biggest pieces of news is not what did happen, but what didn't happen. 75% of registered voters did not show up for that election, only a 25% turnout. So just for the good of the community in general, there will be an effort to turn out voters, both campaigns, to make sure they have some sort of turnout advantage. Supervisor of Elections in Duval County, Mike Hogan, said it on election night, really disappointed with the number of people who chose, I'm not participating in this. So how does that change? Does it change just by matter of, hey, a little higher profile because there's only two candidates at the top of the race? Is it the ground game of all these campaigns? How does that turnout figure change? The answer is all of the above, Kent. I think the fact that it is down to two mayoral candidates is very clarifying at that point. There's a clear choice between these two candidates. And so I think there often is some heightened voter interest when it is down to those last two people. And when we close the night on May the 16th, we will have a mayor-elect here in Jacksonville. So the gravity of the election becomes even greater, and I think that powers turnout. But at the end of the day, the greatest turnout engine is the campaigns themselves. They obviously are very motivated to make sure their voters, their supporters get to the polls. And so you'll see very active efforts on that by both campaigns. Both campaigns are already doing a lot of canvassing, door-to-door knocking. There are probably paid efforts going on as well to try and help increase voter turnout. So at the end of the day, it's the candidates and their campaigns which are going to be the biggest motivation to try and get people out to the polls. Our role here at Channel 4, of course, we're not trying to influence or sway an election. We're trying to report on it. So one of the things that we've changed over the years is in terms of how we report on polling. But when you look at polling, and one of the reasons that we do that is because I can pay for a poll and boy, my numbers might seem really good. So how do you interpret? You mentioned a couple of different polls. One poll may have Davis ahead, one poll may have Deegan ahead. How do you look at those things and then maybe determine what's the real trend behind that? Well, I think, Kent, you have to kind of take a look at these polls and understand what the methodology is. Who have they polled? Have they gotten a representative sample of the electorate? Have the polls done a good job of figuring out what is that final electorate going to look like? And have they actually talked to voters who are really going to go out and vote, or people who've just said they're going to go out and vote? To me, an even better measure of how an election is going is tracking that turnout going forward. Remember, there are three ways we can vote in this election. One is we can vote by mail, and by the way, a reminder that under Florida law now, you have to request a mail ballot every year now. So if someone wants to vote by mail and they haven't received a ballot yet, they have to request that from the Supervisor of Elections. Early voting will be between May the 1st and May the 14th, or of course people can vote on Election Day itself, May the 16th. It's that turnout which I think provides the best quantitative data to seeing how an election is going. Looking at that turnout, voters of which party are coming out, how many Democrats, how many Republicans, how many MPAs. I think that provides the best tracking to help forecast where an election might go.
Yeah, so before we move away from the mayoral campaign, we talked about it in that first election, so divisive, so many negative ads, and we kind of expected that that would be the case here in this runoff time. Someone even mentioned to me this week, it looks like Donna Deegan is actually running against Daniel Davis and the sheriff, because the sheriff now is in an ad basically attacking the Democratic candidate. This seems really unusual to me.
Well, I think it's reflective of the fact that in some of that polling we were just discussing, Kent, it shows that crime overwhelmingly is the issue of greatest concern for voters. And, you know, from the beginning, the Davis campaign has been leaning strongly into the crime issue. Look, in some ways, there are not that many differences between the two candidates. Both Daniel Davis and Donna Deegan have said that they want to increase the number of police officers on the street going forward. So on some issues related to crime, there's not a lot of daylight between the two of them. But I think some of these efforts you're seeing are very reflective of the fact that crime remains a potent issue, something that voters care about. And of course, we are still dealing with a chronic crime challenge here in the city of Jacksonville that's been going on now for close to a couple of decades. Various administrations and city councils and sheriffs have tried to deal with it, but it still persists to some extent. One of the reasons it's a potent issue in the mind of voters, and while you're seeing a lot of discussion about it during this campaign.
So there are some other contests on the ballot. Let's talk about this. Property appraiser, and then the city council districts 2, 7, 8, 9, 11, 14, and then we got this at-large 5. So other things on the ballot. How do you coach people or advise people on, hey, what they should be looking for when it comes to this vote coming up?
Well, all these races are very impactful. It's very easy in our system where we have a strong mayor and a consolidated form of government for people to kind of look at the mayor's race and then maybe not pay quite as much attention to some of these other races, but they're very impactful. Obviously, the property appraiser, among other responsibilities, each year sets the property value of our homes and business properties, which obviously has an impact on the amount of taxes we pay. So that's just one of many responsibilities. And the city council is hugely impactful. It's a co-equal branch of government. The late Mayor Jake Godbold used to say a mayor can't do anything without 10 votes. And that's exactly right. You have to get 10 votes, a majority of the city council, to move forward. So their role is crucial. They also each year are responsible for adopting the more than $1.5 billion city budget, setting the millage rate or the property tax rate. So these are races that also have a huge impact on people's lives. And particularly in the case of city council races, we should remember that in our consolidated form of government, every citizen has 6 council members who are directly accountable to them. Their district council person and the 5 at-large council members who represent everyone in the community. So city council is often the place where people of Jacksonville can use their effective citizenship skills, engage with government, share their hopes and concerns, and try and move government in their direction. Very impactful races that I think voters would be well advised to pay very close attention to as we move forward.
All right, so to help you with that, if you need a little help figuring out who to vote for, don't worry. You head right now to news4jax.com/voters guide. Do this at your leisure, but we've got a complete breakdown of the candidates in every race on the ballot. All right, so don't go anywhere. When we come back, we're shifting to the state capitol. We're headed to the final 2 weeks of Florida's legislative session, and that's next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville with Kent Justice.
Government law attorney Chris Hand joining us for another Hand on Government segment. And so in this time together, Chris, Florida lawmakers have spent 2 consecutive months each year in Tallahassee working on a budget and finding other laws to debate and then potentially pass. You and I were talking here. To me, this feels unusual. This feels like most of the time, I haven't heard much talk about the budget at all. It's been about bills that a conservative majority legislature are sweeping through. It seems like that's been the focus instead of a budget for this state of Florida.
Well, that's right, Kent. As you say, typically the budget is the dominant issue in the legislative session for a variety of reasons. One, it's the only thing the legislature is required to do each year, pass a balanced budget. But two, it's really important for individual legislators or members of the state house or state senate. They want to try and help bring back state funds to their districts, help put their districts in a positive position during that budgeting process. But as you say, that's been very quiet this year. The Republicans now have a supermajority in both houses of Congress, so they've really leaned into passing a number of non-budgetary items, cultural issues, helping to advance Governor DeSantis' agenda that he had before the legislature this year. So it's been an unusual session in that now we're down to the last 2 weeks of the legislature, and there's still a more than $110 billion budget that has to be passed. I think we'll see a lot more attention on that here in the last 2 weeks, but typically that's the dominant issue. Yeah,
so I know something's going on in the background. There's a appropriation committee in chair, people in the Senate and the House for that. I know some of that is going on behind what we're looking at. It's not behind closed doors necessarily. But you would hope that that would come to the fore here as we get toward the end of the session, because just a couple of weeks away.
Well, those state dollars have huge economic impacts around the state. They obviously help to fund infrastructure projects in local communities. Already the legislature has passed a bill on a big crisis in Florida, affordable or attainable housing. So they've already directed some funds to some of those purposes. But the rest of the state budget can really have huge impacts in a local community, which is why you typically see that being the dominant issue. But this year it's been different. There have been a variety of issues passed, whether it's the 6-week abortion ban that the legislature recently passed and the governor signed into law, which is now going to be reviewed by the Florida Supreme Court because of the right to privacy in the Florida Constitution. Changes affecting whether or not you have to have a permit for concealed weapons. That's another big issue. But there are other issues as well. For example, just in this past week, the legislature has put on the 2024 ballot a proposition for voters to decide whether school board races should be partisan or nonpartisan. For the last 25 years under the Florida Constitution, back in 1998, voters decided that school board races should not be partisan. They should be nonpartisan, that we should avoid any kind of partisanship or politicization of our schools. Well, they're going to have a choice in November of 2024 to make that decision again, whether or not we should go back to a system where school board races can be partisan.
Is that particular bill, is that coming from the conservative side? Is that where the effort comes from to make it partisan?
Well, it was introduced by a Republican member of the legislature, Senator Joe Gruters of Sarasota, and his perspective has been, what he says is he believes that school board elections are already partisan, so this is just aligning the law with the reality. But there are people on the other side who feel very strongly that school boards and school systems shouldn't have anything to do with Democrats or Republicans. This is about educating our children, and so as a result, they should stay nonpartisan. So this is just putting the issue on the ballot. Under Florida law, you have to have 60% of the vote to pass a constitutional amendment. So I think we can expect a very robust campaign on both sides and debate in advance of 2024 on that issue. And Kent, there have been other issues as well. Just this week, the Florida legislature voted to change the standard for imposing the death penalty in criminal cases in the state. Previously, in Florida, you had to have a unanimous jury recommendation for a judge to impose capital punishment in a case. That's now been changed to a supermajority standard, an 8-4 vote on that particular issue.
And if you don't mind, on this, we've got a graphic I want to show you. Basically, this bill that we're talking about, it eliminates the requirement for a jury to be unanimous, as you just mentioned. The new law taken effect immediately, but it requires only 8 of 12 jurors to vote in favor of recommending the death penalty for it to be recommended to the judge. And then the law doesn't change the guilt phase for murder cases. That means all 12 jurors have to agree on a guilty verdict before it begins. This really seemed to come out of the fact that the Parkland school shooter was not sentenced to death. It seems like a reaction from state lawmakers about that case.
That's correct. And there is one other state in the union that, has a similar, again, supermajority, not unanimous verdict. And so I think there was some precedent taken from there as well. But I think it is, at least partially a result of that. But it's a significant change in Florida criminal law going forward. And of course, another kind of issue that happened this week is the Florida Board of Education extended the so-called Don't Say Gay law all the way to 12th grade. So now, under this regulation passed by the Florida Board of Education, Florida high schools all the way up to the high school level will not be able to teach issues of sexual orientation or gender identity unless it is consistent with state standards or unless it is part of a health course where parents can choose to opt out. We can certainly expect to see some litigation on that. There's already pending litigation on the original Don't Say Gay law, but expect additional litigation on this because of some First Amendment concerns, free speech concerns, and also equal protection concerns under the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So with a lot of these issues, Kent, whatever the legislature or another arm of state government has done is not the final word. There are going to be court challenges. There's going to be trials and court cases dealing with this. We'll hear about those for a long time to come.
And we're going to take just a little bit more time in this segment. Let me show you some more video here. This was from earlier this week. Florida's lawmakers debating a bill on the House floor. This was midweek, and critics demonstrating inside the Capitol objecting to a bill banning gender-affirming care for minors. So at one point, people threw underwear onto the floor with messages like, "Not your business," and "Leave my genitals alone." And Republicans are arguing this bill protects children from unsafe medical procedures. The reason I show that, Chris, is because a lot of these bills that are coming through this conservative House and Senate and making their way to the governor, they're controversial, and we're actually seeing some lawmakers now saying, well, maybe I'm not on board with this. Are you seeing that too?
Well, that's right. And in fact, Politico this week had an article by Gary Fineout, who's one of the most experienced state legislative reporters in the country, has covered the legislature for decades, where a number of conservative Republican members of the legislature have apparently begun to express some concern about, a variety of the aspects of the agenda and whether they're going too far, particularly on issues like the governor and what he's doing with Walt Disney World, but also on some of these other issues that you mentioned. So it sounds like we have the beginnings of what are some pushback among the legislature itself to that agenda. That would not be uncommon. Every governor in modern Florida history has faced legislators of both parties, right, their own party and the opposition party, who want to maintain those legislative priorities and make sure that they assert themselves as a co-equal branch of government. That's been a little absent during the last couple of years in Florida, but I think we're beginning to see some of that institutional pushback now.
The pendulum might swing back
as it often does.
All right, so stay with us, and you stay with us as well. It's been an issue for years. It is not getting better. More cases than the number of judges can handle. We're going to look at the judicial emergency in the Middle District of Florida, where Jacksonville is in the center of this crisis. Next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville on Channel 4.
Government law attorney Chris Hand is here, ready to educate, because if you're not a lawyer, maybe this doesn't rise to the top of your news feed, and maybe it should. There's a judicial emergency in our area. Explain that for us.
Well, Kent, obviously the courts can have a major impact on our lives, both making decisions on criminal cases, resolving civil or commercial disputes. There are obviously two types of courts, state courts, but also the federal courts. And there is a judicial emergency in the Middle District of Florida right now. Jacksonville is part of the federal Middle District of Florida. There's a southern, northern, and middle district. The Middle District takes up most of the state, includes 12.5 million people, is actually bigger than all but 6 states around the country. Yeah. So a lot of cases being handled. And right now, the caseload per judge is one of the highest in the country, which makes it vital that judgeships be filled when they are open and that additional judgeships be granted to this district. Well, right now, just in the last couple of weeks, the administrative offices of the U.S. courts have declared a judicial emergency related to the Middle District of Florida. There is an open judicial vacancy that became open last July that still hasn't been filled. The Biden administration has not yet sent a nominee to Congress, and that's a matter of great concern because it obviously makes sure other judges then have to handle more cases. There are judges who are about to take what's called senior status, which is a form of retirement.
I've just been reading on this. I didn't realize this. Yeah.
Exactly, where they can have a more limited caseload. That will even put more pressure on the courts at that point. So again, why it's very important that a White House send nominees to the Congress for consideration and that a Congress give those expeditious consideration. People have probably read about some of the disputes back and forth about the confirmation of judges, but it's one of the things that the Biden administration can still do given that Democrats continue to control the United States Senate. So there's a judicial emergency in the Middle District as it relates to that one seat that needs to be filled, but there's about to be an even expanded judicial emergency about other seats, and so it's very incumbent on the White House to move quickly as they can with their nominees and for Congress to give them due and speedy consideration.
And so just a minute left in our conversation here, but it's a matter of, when I don't have that many judges, now I've got more cases than any judge can all fit on their plate. Is that, we don't want judges who are rushing through the case, right?
Well, no, and you know the old expression, Kent, justice delayed is justice denied, and that's very true in these cases. The more kind of caseloads that a judge, that he or she has to handle, that obviously makes it challenging to move those dockets and those cases forward as quickly as they would like to. And so it creates, again, these delays in the process, which for many people can be justice denied. So again, there is the opportunity right now for the Biden administration, for the White House to move judicial nominees forward and for the Congress to give their advice and consent as the Constitution requires and to potentially approve some of those judges. So, and if not, if that doesn't happen, this emergency is only going to become worse.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. One of the things I looked up here, of the 94 federal district courts in the U.S. Middle District of Florida, 13th nationally in the number of cases filed, 11th nationally in civil cases filed per judgeship. Chris, I appreciate it. Really helpful to explain some of this because, again, a lot of us, it wouldn't be on our radar unless someone like you brought it to us. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Our Hand on Government segment once a month here on This Week in Jacksonville.
Thank you.
All right, so This Week in Jacksonville airs each Sunday morning at this time. I'm Kent Justice. We thank you so much for watching. You can watch us on air on Channel 4, also on the CW17 at noon on Sundays. And then you'll find us online at news4jax.com or streaming on News4Jax Plus.
See why every day more people are choosing News4Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.